Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Gwinnell Engelsgerchen, and I'm with the University of California Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program. And I'm coming to you today from the city of Davis, which occupies land that has been home to the Patwin people for thousands of years. And today's webinar on elderberry and food safety is made possible through a grant from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture Food Safety Outreach Program. My collaborators on this project are listed here and join me on the webinar today. I also want to recognize the support of Kate Lee Sutherland with the UC Agriculture and Natural Resources Program Support Unit for providing technical support to today's webinar. And with that, it's my great pleasure to briefly introduce today's webinar speakers. Both Dr. Erin DiCaprio and Dr. Thais Ramos are with the UC Davis Department of Food Science and Technology. April Lancaster is an herbalist and the founder of Lancaster Creations, an organic apothecary based in Visalia, California. You'll be hearing each of them introduce themselves and talk about their work during the webinar, and I'm just thrilled to have their participation. And here's a quick snapshot of what we're going to cover today. Today's webinar is the first in a two-part series. The second webinar will be held a week from today, also at 2 p.m. And that webinar will focus on drying, freezing, making value-added products, and we'll also discuss California's processed food registration. And we'll be putting a link to that in the chat throughout the webinar if you're wanting to join that one as well. Make sure you're signed up. So I suspect that most people that are joining today are familiar with elderberry, but just to give a little bit of background, elderberry is a deciduous perennial shrub. It's native to North America. It produces both berries and flowers with a wide range of culinary and medicinal uses. Blue elderberry, the subspecies Cerulean, is native to California and well adapted to growing conditions here. I know some people are joining from outside of California or maybe growing other subspecies of elderberry, such as the canadensis. But broadly speaking, the information shared today on food safety practices will be applicable across the different subspecies of elderberry, which has, again, long been used as a source of food, medicine, and also music. And it continues to have significance and be used by tribal communities across California. And so in order to ground today's conversation in the significance of elderberry for California's tribes, we are going to hear some words from Lydia Bojorquez, who is a Ohlone Costanoan and involved with the tending and gathering garden at the Cache Creek Conservancy in Yolo County. She wasn't able to join today, but she was gracious enough to make this recording that we're about to hear.
Greetings and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Gwinnell, for reaching out to me and inviting me to address your virtual workshop. I am honored to advocate promoting blue elderberry and its importance from a Native perspective. I will tell you a little about myself first. I am a Ohlone Costanoan Indian from the Monterey area. My ancestral village site is called Kakuntaruk, place of the red-tailed hawk. It is located at the Big Sur. I work with state parks protecting and preserving our sacred sites. I am an advocate for the land that sustained our people since the beginning of time, so that it can continue to sustain us today and our future generations. I live in Yolo County and was made aware of UC's Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education Program while I was serving on the advisory steering committee at Cache Creek Nature Preserve for the tending and gathering gardens. I was an advocate for native plants that are still used today by the native people of this area for foods, medicinal purposes, and basket weaving. The tending and gathering gardens have a sharing, learning, and educational program teaching students of all ages the importance and respect of the land, wildlife, plants, and traditional burns and how it is all connected. It was an amazing 4 years. It is wonderful to know that our medicine is all around us. It all has purpose, just as the blue elderberry. We follow native traditions in elderberry management by carefully pruning to produce a healthy bush and healthy fruit. There are certain times of the year that we prune the elderberry. One in the early spring before it buds, or in the fall once it has given all its fruit. There is another important reason for careful pruning. This is once the elderberry gets bigger. We look for the new, straight shoots as it grows strong to cut and use for our singing sticks, which are used for many occasions. Elderberry is gathered for many uses. The fruit is tasty, healthy, high in antioxidants, which keeps our body's immune system healthy. Elderberry also fights off infections. Elderberry flowers are used for teas to help with stress, colds, flu symptoms, and protects our hearts. Keeping the traditions of our elders, knowing what to gather and when to gather and how to process is what has kept our bodies and minds healthy throughout generations. As food source and material, Native people are always cautious where we gather our elderberry. Today we are aware of pesticides and herbicides that are used for invasive plants. Planes are used to spray larger areas with toxic chemicals that can move over 2 miles depending on environmental conditions. Many of our elders were diagnosed with cancers because of the use of these toxic chemicals used to control invasive plants. Other concerning issues are lands that Native people once were able to go gather on are now private-owned lands, and state parks require an annual application to be filled out that must be reviewed before allowing Native people to go gather. A few years back, we were unable to care for the overgrown elderberry and needed pruning because of federal regulations listed the longhorn blue elderberry beetle as a protected endangered species. To continue to be good stewards of the land and advocates for our native plants and changes over time, Native people still carry on the traditions handed down so we can continue to teach our future generations. When we put food into our mouth, we are also putting medicine into our bodies. It is important we make good choices to continue to promote healthy living. By creating space for elderberry hedgerows, this could benefit wildlife habitat, help with erosion. I encourage our farmers to utilize or create space on their lands for native plants to promote a healthier environment for generations to come. Thank you so much for allowing me this time to share with you a few of our traditions and concerns. Blessings.
So as Lydia says, we find elderberry growing in non-agricultural spaces and forests along roadsides and stream beds. And it's also grown intentionally on farms, planted both in orchard cropping systems and in hedgerows along field edges. And I think there's the next slide that just kind of illustrates this. And so, yeah, so just to say, you know, with this increasing interest in elderberry and elderberry products, syrups, jellies, tinctures, teas, we feel it's important that harvesters and processors understand how to minimize foodborne risks, as well as have knowledge of the applicable regulations. So with that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to our speakers, and Erin DiCaprio is going to kick us off. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Erin DiCaprio. I'm an assistant professor of cooperative extension, and my home department is food science and technology at UC Davis, and I'm also part of the UC Division of Ag and Natural Resources. So my research program focuses on the microbial safety of foods. I have kind of a special niche in that I focus on foodborne viruses. And my extension program really focuses on community food safety. So I work with smaller scale growers, food processors, food entrepreneurs, and consumers on issues related to food safety and food safety regulations. So we wanted to start off today just kind of setting the stage when it comes to food safety and the types of things that can potentially pose a food safety risk to humans, and some of the special considerations when it comes to elderberries on this subject. And so you'll see me again at the end of the webinar today, where I'm going to touch on some of the cottage food regulations and how elderberry processing fits into the cottage food law here in California, but potentially in other states as well. So I just wanted to start out defining the three general types of hazards that can occur in food and potentially lead to a foodborne illness. The first type of hazards are the physical hazards, and these are kind of self-explanatory. They are physical pieces of material that may end up in a food product that, if ingested, could damage the teeth or the digestive tract of the individual that consume that food. So examples would be, pieces of metal or bones or glass that end up in a food product. The second group of hazards that can lead to foodborne illness are the chemical hazards. And so foodborne allergens are included in this group of hazards. And so the big 8 allergens required for food labeling here in the United States are shown here, including milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, crustaceans, wheat, and soy. So those are the big 8 allergens required for labeling in the United States. Other countries have an expanded list, but these are the 8 required for labeling in the United States. However, we know that there are individuals that have allergies to a wide variety of different food ingredients beyond this 8 listed here. Chemical hazards would also include any naturally occurring toxins that might be associated with an ingredient. So this is relevant to elderberries, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But chemical hazards might also include chemicals used as preservatives in a food product if those levels of chemical preservatives being added exceed certain thresholds. Could also include any chemical used for cleaning, sanitizing, or as a processing aid that inadvertently ends up in a food product. So those are considered chemical hazards as well. And then the last group of hazards are the biological hazards. So these include microorganisms that are pathogenic to humans that can end up in a food product. And if they're present in a food and we ingest those foods, it can lead to illness in humans. So I'll first start out just talking about the biological hazards a bit more in depth. And this slide here just shows the different types of microorganisms that can be associated with foods. So these are the general categories. For the most part, when it comes to molds and yeast, so these are probably the microorganisms we're all most familiar with because we can actually see them if they grow to high enough numbers on food products. But these yeasts, the molds, so the fungi that commonly contaminate foods, we're primarily concerned about them because they create a spoiled food product. So they're not associated themselves with a food safety risk. So for the most part, you could eat a moldy piece of bread and not necessarily become ill because of that. When we're talking about pathogenic microorganisms, those that if they contaminate a food product lead to illness in humans, we're primarily concerned about certain types of bacteria, parasites, and viruses. So for example, Escherichia coli or E. coli 0157H7, that's the bacteria that's commonly associated with ground beef and more recently spinach and romaine lettuce. So that is a bacterial foodborne pathogen. So certainly not all microorganisms are pathogenic. It's a very small subset of these microorganisms that are capable of causing human disease. Many of them cause food spoilage. Others are really beneficial in foods. We use them for fermentation, to supplement our own native microflora. So a very small subset of these microorganisms are pathogenic, but they do cause a significant number of illnesses in humans, which is why I have a job in microbial food safety, and we have so many food safety regulations in this country. So these pathogenic microorganisms can be introduced through many mechanisms during food production. So they might come in on raw ingredients and utilized in a formulated food product. They might be in water sources used to irrigate a food product. They might be present naturally in the soil. They might be just present in a food processing environment. So if a food contact surface is contaminated with one of these pathogens, any food touching that surface would be cross-contaminated. And so you may have heard of good manufacturing practices. So these are standardized criteria that must be met if you're producing food for human consumption that address many of these sources of pathogenic organisms in the food processing environment. So there are standards for employee health and hygiene, so requiring hand washing, for example, of food handlers. There are pest control programs required under good manufacturing practices to minimize any sort of insect or wildlife intrusion into a food processing space. So these good manufacturing practices are really kind of the baseline criteria for the safe manufacture of foods. So beyond that, there's the food product itself, and there are these inherent characteristics of the food that can help control or minimize the risks associated with these pathogenic microorganisms. So the major factors we think about in a food product that impact its microbial safety are, what is the food composed of? Is there the appropriate nutrients in that food for one of these pathogens to be able to grow in that particular product? What's the acidity level of the food? So many of these foodborne pathogens will either be inhibited from growing or even inactivated or killed if the acid level in the food product is high enough. Another important criteria we look at is the temperature of the food. Is the food going through some kind of cooking or thermal process? Is that food going to be stored at room temperature or refrigerated? Also the time, so the length of time that we're cooking at a specific temperature or we're holding food at a specific temperature is really critical in terms of microbial food safety. Oxygen is another really important factor. There are some types of microbial pathogens that need oxygen to be able to grow. Others, oxygen is toxic to them. So we need to understand what is the oxygen exposure of that food or within that food package. And then the last criteria we really focus in on is the water activity. So this is different than the moisture content, which is the overall amount of water in a product. So water activity, in contrast to moisture content, is the amount of free water, as we call it, in the food product. So that is the amount of water that is freely available for these microbial pathogens to utilize for their own metabolism. So water for these microorganisms to be able to grow in a food product. So we can lower water activity by physically removing water. So for example, dehydrating, but we can also manipulate the water activity by adding different kinds of solutes to a food. So things like salt and sugar will actually bind water within the food matrix and make that water unavailable for microorganisms to be able to grow or increase in numbers. So that's another way we can control for the microbial safety of a food. So I want to spend a minute here talking about pH, because when it comes to elderberries, this is a really important concept to kind of understand. And so if you think back to maybe some of those general chemistry courses you've had in the past, you were probably exposed to the pH scale, which is a logarithmic scale from 0 to 14. And it's essentially the measure of acidity of a liquid or a food. So a pH of 7 is considered a neutral pH, and pHs below 7 are considered acidic, and pHs above 7 are considered basic or alkaline. So that's general chemistry. When we talk about foods, we kind of have a different spectrum of the overall pH scale we're looking at. So most foods actually are acidic. They're going to have a pH below 7, that neutral level. There's actually very few foods that have a pH that is considered neutral. Black olives are one because they're lye cured. So there's a base added to those olives during processing that gives them kind of that neutral pH. Milk is another one, egg whites that have kind of that neutral pH of 7, but basically every other type of food is going to have on the pH scale a pH below 7. So be considered acidic on this overall pH scale. But when we're talking about food safety, we have a different pH scale that we kind of focus in on. And that is based on this dividing line of a pH of 4.6. And so this is kind of the cut point on what we determine a high acid food or a low acid food. And this is based on our history of canning foods in this country to prolong the shelf life. So at a pH of 4.6 or below, that pH is capable of inhibiting the germination of the spores of the bacteria Clostridium botulinum, that if it grows in a food can cause the disease botulinum, which is in many cases deadly. And so this pH of 4.6 was determined early on in the canning industry to inhibit the growth of that particular pathogenic microorganism in canned foods. And it has since kind of continued on as this dividing line from what's considered a low acid food product. So low acid foods are those that have a pH above 4.6, and a high acid food. So a very acidic food product that has a pH of 4.6 or below. So this is really important if you are canning any products. So we worry about Clostridium botulinum in canned foods or these thermally processed, shelf-stable food products. And so, I know there's a lot of interest in value-added processing of elderberries, and producing jams and jellies is one of those very popular value-added products. And so I just want to highlight here that the pH of fruits and vegetables can vary based on subspecies or varietals. It may also vary that pH value depending on the ripeness of the fruit or vegetable when it's harvested, as well as some other environmental factors. And actually, kind of when I heard about elderberries was in this space around the pH of elderberries. So there were some questions related to whether or not elderberries are considered a high acid or low acid food. So depending where you are and the subspecies of elderberry you're working with, that may be different. So the Western or the blue elderberry has been shown to have a pH below 4.6. And so that came out of some work that UC Syrup did in collaboration with some chemists in my department at UC Davis. And they showed that consistently the pH of the blue elderberry was below 4.6. So this would be considered a high acid fruit. Other subspecies, however, that can be found in other parts of the United States have been shown to have a pH above 4.6. So in this case, they'd be considered a low acid fruit. And so this is really relevant for someone that's interested in making a jam, jelly, or even a syrup, because if you're talking about a high acid fruit like the Western blue elderberry, that's likely something that you can do under a cottage food law, under less kind of stringent food safety regulations. But if we're talking about a fruit that has a pH above 4.6, that's a low acid fruit, that's a whole other set of food safety considerations. So I just want to highlight that here. So it is really important to know the pH of the starting ingredients you're using, the pH of your formulated product, the water activity, because all those are really critical for how things play out in terms of the overall safety of your product, as well as the regulations that will apply to its production. So really quickly, I just want to touch on physical hazards. So again, these are things that can physically damage the mouth or digestive tract if they're present in the food. So things like bones, metal shavings, glass. So there can be many sources of these physical hazards. A really common one is employees. So someone wearing earrings during production, for example, and an earring falling into a food product. So just be aware of that if you are thinking about commercial production, how you're going to minimize contamination with these physical hazards. And this slide here shows some common types of physical hazards and sources. And I just want to highlight here glass. So glass is a really popular packaging material. It has great barrier function to, water and gas. You can see the product inside, but glass itself is considered a physical hazard. So if you are packaging any food product in glass, it's really important to have a process in place where you have a glass management plan where you're not allowing glass to end up in food product. And so the last group of hazards are the chemical hazards. So these could be naturally occurring in the food product. They could be intentionally added chemicals like preservatives or unintentionally added chemicals. And I'll touch on some examples of each. So the naturally occurring chemicals, these could be your allergens, different kinds of toxins found naturally in mushrooms, for example, or generated in shellfish or by certain types of molds growing in a food product. But for elderberries in particular, we have this naturally occurring chemical hazard, samberganin. So this is a precursor to hydrogen cyanide. So it's a cyanogenic glycoside that when ingested is enzymatically converted in our body to hydrogen cyanide. So I think everyone can agree we don't want to be consuming hydrogen cyanide. I think the good thing here is that this toxin is primarily associated with the stems and the leaves of the elderberry plant. So making sure you remove those stems and leaves is really critical to help minimize that particular risk. And for the Western blue elderberries and other subspecies here in the US, the levels of this toxin are relatively low compared to European species. And you can also help degrade this toxin by heating or fermenting elderberry products. So a positive thing, certainly. And intentionally added chemicals, these would be things like preservatives that you're adding. All of those kind of have upper thresholds of use. So exceeding any of those upper levels could potentially be a chemical hazard. So some examples here of some of those intentionally added chemicals that have specific maximum levels of use in foods. And then there are unintentionally added chemicals. So things that may come in on a raw ingredient that you can't control, or migration of chemicals from packaging. So there are, again, kind of upper limits of allowance of these unintentionally added chemicals in foods as well, but more relevant to a very large scale processor. So I just, want to kind of frame around how these different hazards play into elderberry production, either on hedgerows or if you're foraging some of these elderberries in the wild. So Thais is going to talk in a minute during production, how you would mitigate some of these hazards in post-harvest. But if you are harvesting from hedgerows, just think about, what's around those hedgerows. Are you next to a roadway, which may introduce some more novel chemical hazards or biological hazards compared to, more traditional production methods? Is there any unique physical hazards that are being introduced because of the proximity of these hedgerows to roads or to other environmental conditions that, again, may not be encountered during other production methods? And then on the foraging side, same types of things. I think in addition, as touched on in the introduction, you have no control necessarily over how people are applying pesticides or other chemicals if you're foraging wild elderberries. So definitely consider those things when you're sourcing elderberries, and think about ways to maybe mitigate some of these risks for your own use, personal use, or if you're selling commercially. And then I just want to touch briefly on this concept of approved sources for ingredients. So if you are producing a product for commercial sale, many states, including California, require you to source ingredients from an approved source, which primarily include retail food markets like grocery stores, registered farms, or registered food processors with the state. It does not generally include home gardens, community gardens, or foraged ingredients. So those generally are not going to be approved sources. However, there is a lot of county to county variation in what's considered an approved source, or even the requirement for sourcing from an approved source. So I would just encourage everyone to check in at the county level, because there may be some exceptions to this rule, depending on where you are in the state. And certainly if you're in another state outside of California, there may be different criteria for you to produce, for you to source ingredients if you're producing a commercial product. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ramos, who's going to talk more about food safety practices during production and harvesting. So if you have questions for any of us during the course of the webinar, please enter those questions into the Q&A box and we'll address them at the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. That was great, and just a terrific amount of information. And so I'm glad that we'll have this for folks to refer back to in the future. And Thais, are you ready to take it away? All right.
Hi, I'm Thais Ramos. I am an associate specialist in Dr. Erin DiCaprio lab in the Department of Food Science and Technology at UC Davis. And for the past years, I have been working on extension and applied research programs that address food safety from production to the end consumer. So very excited to be here, and thank you everyone who was able to join us today. So I'll be emphasizing food safety best practice for harvesting and for post-harvesting. So the topics I'm going to cover today include types of hazards in food, just briefly because Dr. DiCaprio already mentioned during her presentation, food safety best practice for harvesting and for post-harvesting. Erin already mentioned the types of hazards in food, so I'll just briefly mention, highlight the biological hazards, which most of the contamination of fresh produce is caused by microorganisms such as E. coli 157, Listeria monocytogenes, and Salmonella. They are like, they have been associated with outbreaks in the past years. So here is just a quick overview of how food gets contaminated during the production chain. So you can see here, so the food can become contaminated in many ways from the production to the end consumer. However, most contamination falls into these three areas, as you can see here on this slide. So during growing or pre-harvest, for example, if the fields are sprayed with contaminated water, so the produce will be contaminated before harvest. During post-harvest, so again, if you are using contaminated wash for post-harvest processing activities such wash, produce, pack, or chill fruits and vegetables, the contamination can spread to those items, and also during handling. So then we might think how we can reduce contamination. That's why it's so important to focus on best practice to reduce these risks. So basically, the goal is to prevent contamination from to prevent produce contamination in the first place. So as I previously mentioned, I'll just I'm going to cover an overview of food safety best practice for harvesting. So here you can see on this slide, I would like to, it's very important to highlight that food safety starts on the farm. So here you can see some sources of microbial contamination in the field. So during the growing phase, the produce may become contaminated by wildlife and domesticated animals, by improperly treated soil amendments, or by poor worker health and hygiene, or by contaminated agricultural water. And it's also important to highlight because the fresh produce, it's particularly important because they are most often eaten raw and do not receive any cooking step to kill pathogen microorganisms. So during my presentation, there is a lot of overlaps for best practice for harvesting that also applies for post-harvesting operations, such as worker, personal hygiene, cleaning and sanitation, and facilities management. But unfortunately, we don't have much time to talk about these topics again while I'm talking about the post-harvesting operations. So I'll just highlight some activities during the while I'm talking about the best practice for harvesting. Sorry. So humans, they can be a source of many foodborne hazards. They can spread, they can carry, introduce, and spread pathogens through hands, clothing, or footwear because they are actually handling fresh produce. It's very important to exclude sick workers from any handling activities with flowers and elderberries, and also exclude them from the areas where these activities are taking place. It's frequent hand washing is a critical step to ensure that all the personnel do not transfer biological or chemical hazards to food. And also clothing, should be worn. Clothing worn should be also always clean. So here are other things that you can do to keep your harvest safe. So any unclean surface that contacts produce can harbor pathogens and also can serve as a source of contamination. So it's very important to establish a schedule for cleaning and sanitizing harvest equipment and tools. There also should be a standard operation procedure for cleaning and sanitizing these items during the harvest season. In terms of equipment, equipment and tools, they should be made of material that are easy to clean and sanitize. So stainless steel and food grade plastic, they are easy to clean. They are good examples because they are easy to clean and sanitize. So if you are using wood or cardboard for harvesting, they are porous and cannot be properly cleaned and sanitized. And it's also a good idea to use a plastic single liner to minimize hazards if you are using this kind of material during harvesting. And for facility management, it's important to keep facilities and packing house clean and sanitary, and avoiding standing water, because standing water can support the growth of pathogens and also can act as a home for pests. This also applies for post-harvest operations. So regarding sanitation practice, you can use the 4 steps for cleaning and sanitizing a food contact surface when possible for equipments and tools such as harvest containers. So the first step is to remove debris and dirt from surface. This second step, you can use an appropriate detergent to scrub the surface. Then you can you rinse the contact material, the food surface, using, it's very important to use potable water to rinse the surface, to remove residual detergent and soil. And the last step, you may apply sanitizer. You can use a food contact sanitizer, and it's very important to follow the label directions when you are using this type of sanitizer. Here are also a few considerations to make during harvest. So it's important to not harvest any elderberries or elderflowers contaminated with fecal contamination, visible fecal contamination, such as bird droppings. It's important to train workers because they will be able to identify and reduce risks when they are harvesting. Also, never harvest produce that touches or falls on the floor. And it's important to remove harvested produce from fields as soon as possible, because they need to be cooled down to remove the field heat and reduce loss and limit microorganism growth. So as I previously mentioned, fresh produce can become contaminated by many ways during the harvesting activities. So during the post-harvesting operations, pathogens, they may be introduced by numerous sources, such as post-harvest equipment, as you can see here on this slide, water, harvest and packing containers, also by hands and clothing. So I just wanted to point out that the importance of sanitation to minimize microbial contamination. So when I was talking about the 4 steps for cleaning and sanitizing, you can also apply those 4 steps for the post-harvesting operations to minimize microbial contamination. Dr. DiCaprio already mentioned about the good manufacturing practice, or GMPs. So they are minimal things that you can do for processing foods under a sanitary condition. So you can see here on these slides, so they cover things like personal hygiene, what the type of equipment and utensils that you can use in your facility, how to hold and distribute food to minimize adulteration. So it's critically important that good manufacturing practices are properly implemented to minimize risks associated with biological hazards. And in the case of elderberries post-harvest operation, after harvesting of flowers and berries, they following this practice, all the products will have a consistent quality, and food safety risks, they are not introduced to the post-harvesting operations. So there are a few methods of the stemming of harvested elderberries. They are listed here. So after the harvesting step, the berries, they can be stemmed fresh or frozen, depending on your processing, through manual or mechanized processes. But regardless the type of method that you choose, it's important to clean and sanitize the equipment. Dr. DiCaprio already mentioned about the compounds, the toxic compounds that may be present in stems and leaves. So I'll just point out here again that it's very important to remove stems and leaves during the destemming activities to remove possible sources of cyanogenic glycoside, which is a toxic compound. So for post-harvest water can be used for numerous activities. So they can be used, it can be used for rinsing and washing harvested product. It can be used for cleaning and sanitation, for ice making and hand washing. And the post-harvest water has the potential to spread contamination directly and indirectly. So you have to make sure that your water is safe, and the water quality standard must have no detectable generic E. coli per 100 mils per sample size. This is very important. And depending on the pool and depending on the source of water that you are using, such as municipal water, it's important to keep a certificate of compliance that water meets the Safe Drinking Water Act. And if you are using well water, water should be tested several times during the year to ensure that no detectable generic E. coli criteria is met. And all the files, they should be, all the results, they should be kept on file. So sanitizers, they are recommended for use in post-harvest water. I would like to emphasize here that this sanitizer is intended for post-harvest water sanitation. So the addition of sanitizer, that adding a sanitizer is not intended to wash the product, but instead to prevent cross-contamination. Also, it's very important that you need to make sure that you are following the label requirements, the label directions, because the label is the law. And that sanitizer is approved for the use with food or with food contact surface. This is very important. So there are many types of post-harvest water sanitizers, and I just listed some here on this slide. So harvest elderberries, they are highly perishable, and they are normally bulk washed to remove stems, leaves, and unripe fruits and other debris. Again, the water used for washing elderberries and other flowers, they must be no detectable generic E. coli. And if you decide to reuse this water for multiple batches, the water quality must be monitored and maintained during the process. So here on this slide, you can see a few examples of spray washing methods for small and also for large scale operations. On the picture on the left, you can place the berries on a bowl or colander and rinse the berries under cold and potable water to remove soil and other debris. On the right, two pictures here for large scale operations. The berries, they may be placed on a conveyor that moves under spray heads, rinsing the berries, as you can see here. So if the water is collected and recirculated, then this is considered batch water. So you have to add a sanitizer to maintain the water quality. And in some cases, berries, they may be washed using the dunk tank. So you can use this method where the bulk berries, they will be placed in a tank filled with water. And when using this method, sanitizers should be added to the water to maintain the water quality during the washing process. If you are reusing this water for multiple batches, the organic matter will build up. So the organic load can impact the efficacy of the sanitizers added to the water. Here on this third picture, it's the elderberries also can be washed using a triple wash system. So in this practice, the tank 1 and the tank 2, they have sanitizer, and the tank 3 often includes water with no sanitizer. So there's an intention to remove high levels of residual sanitizer, but however, utilizing an approved sanitizer on the right level at the right concentration will not result in high levels on the produce surface. So with that, I'm short on time. If you have any questions, you can add the questions to the Q&A and we will answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thais. That's terrific. And again, it's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So I really appreciate you condensing it all. So now we want to bring April Lancaster to the floor. And, we want to be able to, in this conversation, we want to hear from people that are actually doing the work, making products. And so that's what April is going to share with us now. So thanks so much for joining us, April.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. My name is April Triana Lancaster. I am a mother, an herbalist, and an entrepreneur here in Tulare County, California. I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the land I am living and working in and on is the ancestral homeland of the Tule River Band of Yokits. I was born and raised in Dinuba, California, and made a short shuffle south to Visalia in 2004. In 2012, my daughter was diagnosed with a medical condition that could potentially be linked to chemical exposure. As a result of this diagnosis, I took a radical approach and made a pretty serious lifestyle change that eventually led me on the path of creating what has become Lancaster Creations LLC. I was very lucky in that I gained the attention of my local Whole Foods market less than 6 months in business. And during the courtship and subsequent onboarding process with Whole Foods Market, I was given a tremendous amount of resources in regards to regulations, beginning with becoming familiarized with the FD&C Act, which is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. I was very aware at an early stage that there is a lot of responsibility that goes in with the production and manufacture of herbal goods. Once I came to this realization, I thought it would be a really good idea to become more familiar with the ingredients that I was using in these products. And this journey led me to the California School of Herbal Studies, which is the oldest herb school in North America. I have since completed more than 200 classroom hours of study in herbal medicine, and my specialty is still organic skin and body care manufacture and sales. I own and operate a brick and mortar shop in historic downtown Visalia. I am a CDFA certified producer, and additionally, I am the organizer of the Downtown Visalia Certified Farmers Market. I primarily sell my goods directly to consumers at local farmers markets and in my retail storefront. I am a permitted cottage food manufacturer of tea tisane, which is essentially tea without tea in it. It's just with herbs, scratch-made vinegars, vinegar infusions, and preserves. I use elderberries and elderflowers in each of the aforementioned cottage food products. These products must be made from berries and flowers obtained from an approved source, which means that they may not be wild harvested. Moreover, there are laws about how and where we can collect wild elderberries and how they can be used. I like to spend a lot of time in the giant forest. So I have a special place that I go to in the national forest, which is outside of the national park. And there are different harvesting rules in the national forest than there are in the park. You cannot collect anything at all, even if it's fallen on the ground in the park. But in the forest, you're allowed to collect for personal use. So there are some really great boundary maps. So if anybody wants to look, personal use only, you cannot sell anything collected in the giant forest, or in the forest. For me, it's the giant forest. There's lots of local elderberry bushes up there. Different varieties that you've never seen in your life before. It's pretty amazing. Tulare County delayed implementation of CFO permitting until 2014. And when I applied in 2015, there were plenty of gaps in the understanding of regulations within the various departments of the regulatory bodies. I had prepared over 50 recipes, and after several weeks, my inspector called me and informed me that most of the menu items I had submitted were not permissible under the cottage food laws. Initially, many of the formulas I had submitted were for vinegar infusions, or acetums, as we call them in the herbal world. They were what I was most safe making because they in nature are super acidic. They're mostly made of acetobacter, which is, as far as the herbal world is concerned, it pretty much can kill anything. It's one of the safest herbal products you can make, but that is not the stance of the Department of Public Health. So I was really sad to know that none of my vinegar infusions at that time were permissible. Initially, I was really confused, and I am a challenging person. So naturally, I challenged my inspector as far as the vinegars. They were listed on the approved food lists. And after many conversations, I was directed to contact the head of retail regulations within the state of California Department of Public Health. She and I went back and forth by email for weeks, probably, until we finally got on the phone together and discussed these regulations. She explained to me that vinegars, as they pertained at that time to the cottage food regulation, were from scratch-made vinegars only. They were not to include any other food substance or infusion. I clarified with her if I were to feed my vinegar, my acetobacter as it is, with an alcohol extract of an herb or a fruit or a flower, it would still technically be a vinegar with the alcohol extract of an herb, fruit, or flower. So it's not another food product. So she did agree that it would be permissible under the law as it is written, but the product would have to be labeled as a vinegar and nothing else. It has been quite an interesting experience transitioning into the cottage food world from the herbal body care manufacturing world. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has a test to determine what category a product belongs to. Is it a food? Is it a drug? Or is it a cosmetic? If it is a food or a drug, there are divisions of the FDA or state regulators who become responsible, and the manufacturers must register with that department. If it is a cosmetic, the government or regulators are largely hands-off. There are no regulations as to the ingredients that can be used, in what concentration, and in what type of product. I have been trained personally to keep close records of traceability and good manufacturing practices in place. However, I know that that is not the common scenario in cottage food manufacture or herbal body care manufacture, but I have extensive training in this area. And so I do tend to keep, I have a journal, it's a formulations log, everything goes into it, traceability as far as who provided me with the substance that I'm using to make the product, what their lot number was. And that's all really relevant to being able to recall a product if there is some type of a bacterial, I want to say infection because that's just the word that I use, but if there's some type of a contaminant, you want to be able to recall the product. Back in 2015, when the head of the retail operations for California Department of Public Health told me that vinegar infusions were not included in cottage food law, I asked, who should I talk to in order to change that? It is mind-boggling still to me to this day that vinegars from scratch are approved on the cottage food law, and vinegars that are infused are not as safe as far as the regulators were concerned back then. It took almost 2 years for vinegar infusions to be included in the list of approved cottage foods, but they did get added. And last year, a new tool was added to the California Department of Public Health Food and Drug branch to submit a request to add a new a new non-potentially hazardous food to the cottage food list, which is really an awesome thing because now they've added alcohol extracts. And so I'm getting a whole stack of papers ready to send to the California Department of Public Health. I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that these types of programs are fluid and that the more familiar you are with the regulations, the more likely you will be to successfully fit your operations within those regulations. And it's really important to advocate for yourself as far as your products are concerned. So that's kind of all I have for you guys today.
That's so great. Thank you so much, April. I think there's so much to take from what you said, you know, in terms of the record keeping and the dialogue and advocacy with the regulators. And so, yeah, thank you so much for all of that. And I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Great. So, you know, I think April did a great job of kind of highlighting how complicated and not easily to navigate some of these regulations can be, you know, kind of at the onset, trying to figure out if your product is a food, drug, or cosmetic. Where does it fall in this grand scheme of regulations? So I would definitely kind of heed her advice. You know, understanding the regulations as much as you can, really important, and be your own advocate as much as you can be. So I'm going to just kind of end today talking a little bit about the cottage food law. And I should have said cottage food laws because each state has its own cottage food law. This is not a federal regulation. It's a state by state law. And today I'm kind of focused in primarily on California. So if you're from California, I'm hoping that you kind of walk away from here at least knowing where to go to answer some of the questions you might have. But if you're in another state, I'll try and point out some of the commonalities that exist between common food laws in different states and try and point you in a direction to find that information for yourself as well. So these cottage food laws, they allow for certain types of low risk or those non-potentially hazardous foods to be processed in a home kitchen. These laws do vary from state to state. So you do want to make sure that you're looking at your individual state's cottage food law because the list of allowable products is going to vary some from state to state. Where you can source ingredients from is going to vary from state to state. So just to put that out there, you do want to make sure that you're looking at your own individual state cottage food law. And also really important that you understand these are state laws. They are not federal regulations, which means you can only sell your cottage foods within the state that you are a registered cottage food operation. So you cannot sell across state lines. Once a food product crosses state lines, that it is an FDA regulated product and you're subject to FDA regulations. So just know that. I know with the internet and everything that state lines are kind of blurred, but it is very clear with these cottage food laws that your products are not to enter interstate commerce. So if you're a California cottage food operation, sell in California, not in neighboring states. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about when we say low risk foods or these non-potentially hazardous foods, there's kind of this spectrum of food safety risk inherent to different kinds of food products. Typically, what we consider to be a low risk food or one of these non-potentially hazardous foods is a water that has a very low water activity and or has a very low pH. So a very acidic food product or a food product that has a very limited amount of free water in the product. So you can see some examples of low risk foods highlighted here. Generally, these low risk foods are going to have the fewest regulations associated with them. So the cottage food law is a great option if you're just trying to explore the processed food space to get started, because it's going to have the lowest barrier in terms of regulatory compliance and the type of facility you need to process in. That being said, it's still very complicated to navigate the process, but compared to some of the other regulatory requirements for food processors, that's kind of the easiest route to go. Higher risk foods are those that can pose a significant health risk if their production, their storage isn't tightly controlled. So some of the kind of the medium risk foods are listed here. Refrigerated foods fall into this category. I just want to mention here, if you are thinking of producing a refrigerated food, that means that food is refrigerated from the time you make it all the way through transportation and storage to that final retail outlet. So refrigeration means refrigeration throughout that whole supply chain. Some of the highest risk foods are those that are associated with the risk of botulism. So these low acid canned food products or products that are acid is added prior to canning, if those are not produced in a highly controlled manner, they can pose a botulism risk. So those are typically going to be the foods that have the most regulatory oversight. They're going to be the most expensive to produce. So I always try and encourage people starting out, if you can go with one of those low risk food categories, you're going to be much more successful, at least in, starting out, because you're going to have less overhead expenses and things of that nature. So this map is from the Forager website, which if you're not familiar and just exploring cottage foods, this is a great site to kind of start out with, because it lists all of the states in the US that have some version of a cottage food law. You can actually search by state to see which types of foods are allowed in those states. And often it'll kind of shunt you over to the regulatory body in each state that oversees the cottage food law or the cottage food permits in that state. So a really great place to start out. There's only one state in the US that doesn't have some version of a cottage food law. So most folks will have this as an option to start a food business. So here in California, our cottage food law, we have two different types of permits that you can apply for. The Class A permit allows you to sell directly to consumers only. And just recently, they increased the maximum gross annual sales for both types of permits here in California. So if you have a Class A permit, you can max out at $75,000 a year. If you're a Class B permit holder, this allows you to sell direct to consumers, but also sell through stores and restaurants as well, where you're not the one directly selling and handing over to the product to consumers. And for your Class B permit, the new gross annual sales max is $150,000 per year. So there is this cap on the amount of money that you can make as a cottage food operator. So some folks, once you get close to that maximum, is when you might transition into being a processed food registration holder, which we'll touch on in next week's webinar. But if you're not in California, just know that these sales maximums exist in other states as well. So you do want to check and see what that maximum gross annual sales max would be in your state. And also you may not have that option for a Class B permit in other states. You may be constrained to only selling direct to consumers, depending where you live. In California, to get your permit, you have to take a food handler certificate course. So something analogous to a Serve Safe food handlers course. And you also have to register with your county environmental health department. So just these are the basic steps you need to go through. There is, as April mentioned, this list of approved foods that you can make with your cottage food permit. I would say they're fairly general categories. So as she was kind of speaking to, you have to send all of these recipes and formulations to your county environmental health department, and they'll kind of give you a thumbs up or thumbs down. But depending who you're talking to, I think, as April mentioned, it's really good to educate yourself because you can push back to some level and kind of talk through why certain things are allowed versus not. Just some examples of some things we can do here in California, and many other states have a very similar list of allowable cottage foods. It's not James jellies and preserves, it's Jan's jellies and preserves. And for California and other states, most of the cottage food laws require that these Jan's jellies and preserves meet the standard of identity for fruit preserves outlined in CFR 21 Part 150, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So in California, regardless if you have a Class A or Class B permit, you're allowed to take orders and do your transactions on the phone, internet, other digital methods, or of course in person. And you can also deliver your foods in person by mail or using a third-party delivery service. Other states, again, this may not be the case. Some states you're really restricted to only delivering in person. So again, if you're not in California, make sure you're familiar with your state's law. This is the expanded list of cottage foods allowable in California. So April mentioned if there is a food you're interested in producing that's not on this list, there is now an application process to get foods added to the approved cottage food list. I would say you have to have a strong justification as to why. So understanding that low risk, non-potentially hazardous food, like what classifies a food for falling into that category, really important if you're going to petition the state for adding something to the list. So in California, our Department of Food and Drug branch under the Department of Health, Food and Drug branch does have some good resources for cottage food operations, though they are not the entity issuing the cottage food permits. This is at the county level through the county environmental health department. So in California, you can find some useful information on cottage foods at the state level, but they are not the one issuing the permits. Again, not the same in other states. In many states, these permits are issued by the state and not at the county level. So seek out your state's oversight entity on cottage foods and familiarize yourself with how you would put in the permit application. So if you go to California's Department of Health, Food and Drug branch website to their cottage food page, you can go and find this list they've generated of local environmental health departments. So you open that document, you can find the county in which you reside and you're going to be producing your cottage foods. And this document will then shuttle you over to the county's website. And many of these counties have their own cottage food page as well. So in Yolo County, that's where I reside. If I go to the cottage food page, it has all the information on how I would submit my registration permit, how much it costs, the type of training that I need. And so it's kind of the one-stop shop for everything I need in Yolo County. I will say each county is going to have a slightly different process for how you apply for the permit, how much it costs to get either the Class A or Class B permit. And just note, additional permits may be required if you're selling your product outside of your home. So if you're selling at farmer's market or a farm stand, there may be additional county permits you need to sell your cottage food through that venue. So Part 150 of Title 21, this is the standard of identity for fruit butters, jellies, preserves, and related products. So if you are already a cottage food producer, you probably are familiar with the standard of identity and how high the sugar content is in these preserves to meet the standard of identity. So this particular regulation outlines a list of allowable fruits you can use in these products, and then specific fruit to sweetener ratios you have to use to meet these requirements. So just know, if you're thinking about elderberry, jams, jellies, preserves, you need to meet this standard of identity. It is a lot of sugar in these products, but just so you're aware, in most states that have a cottage food law, they also require the adherence to the standard of identity for jams and jelly production. But kind of across the board, there are some standard requirements for a cottage food operation nationally. For most places, this needs to be your primary residential kitchen, so your home kitchen. It can't be a garage or a converted shed that you're producing these cottage foods. You need to have hand washing stations designated and available within your space. No carpet in the kitchen. You need to have food contact surfaces that are able to be cleaned and sanitized. Most cottage food laws also have some language around a management plan to keep animals and children out of the kitchen while you're producing. There's also a requirement that you have standardized cleaning and sanitation procedures. So you provide a list of equipment and tools that you're using and kind of a brief explanation of how you're going to be cleaning and sanitizing those tools. Hand washing, really critical. So that's one of the things you go through in the required training, just frequency of hand washing, proper hand washing technique. And then, another thing to consider in California, and April touched on this too, is just approved ingredient sources. So no wild foraging of elderberries if you're going to produce cottage foods. There may be, depending the county in which you live, some flexibility on getting, if you have elderberries growing on your own land, but that it's not registered as a farm, or in some community gardens, some mechanisms to add those as approved sources, but it varies significantly from county to county. So really important to build that relationship with folks in your county, and maybe try and talk to multiple people within that office if possible, just so you're sure you're talking to someone with the appropriate experience to give you the correct answers. And then there's labeling requirements for cottage foods. So these are the labeling requirements for California, but they're pretty standard in other states as well. So this label has to say made in a home kitchen, have the address of the home. In California, it's also required you have your permit license number and the county in which it was issued. You need an ingredient list. If you have any allergenic ingredients, those have to be called out on a separate line, and then the net weight of the product in the package. And so this is just an example of what a label for a cottage food product would look like in California. Again, very similar standard labeling requirements in other states. So just be aware that you have to meet this specific criteria in your label. And so in the next webinar, we'll talk about the labeling requirements if you're scaling up your business, and what it looks like to meet the FDA labeling requirements, which are much more rigorous than the cottage food labeling requirements. So with that, I think we'll open it up and have some question and answer.
That's great. Thank you so much, Erin. And yeah, we have just a few minutes to take some questions from our participants. So if you have a question and you want to drop it in the Q&A, please do so. We have a couple here that I'll start with. So there's a question about test strips and sanitizers for certified organic washing. I don't think that was mentioned, but any recommendations that any of you would like to speak to?
Well, I'm not an organic certifier, so that piece I might not be able to address too closely, but I will look and put into the chat. There's a curated list of approved food contact surface water sanitizers that was put together by the Produce Safety Alliance out of Cornell. And so that list is kind of a good starting point. If you're looking for a sanitizer, I think they also have it organized by what's OMRI listed versus not, but I would always caution someone that is an organic producer processor before you use any chemistry. Just check in with your organic certifier to make sure you know what you're using and how you're going to be using it jives with your organic certification.
That's great, thank you. We also had a question that came in with the registrations that was about dehydrating berries and trying to separate the stem material from the berries themselves. And the person was wondering, to what extent should they be nervous about including some of the stem material in their brandy infusions?
I'll take that one. I definitely think that it is quite important to make sure that there are no stems. But if you're putting it into a brandy infusion, depending on the alcohol content, I mean, brandy is usually going to be fairly high, so the alcohol tends to convert the toxins. So you're usually fairly safe with alcohol, but still considerations should be taken. You should exclude as much of the barky material as possible.
Anything to add to that? Or we have another question about, let's see, producing glycerin-based elderberry syrup, and glycerin is the sweetener, so not adding sugar. And would that type of product qualify for cottage food production?
No, personal experience with this one, right?
Yes, I do. It's called a glycerite decoction, and that is not permissible under the cottage food law. So the way the regulation is written, it must be 45 parts nutritive carbohydrate sweetener. So basically they're saying sugar or a sugar substitute. I had a question for Erin because I have successfully argued that honey is a nutritive carbohydrate sweetener, but honey also always ferments. And so I know that even if they permit me to sell it that way, it's not a shelf-stable product. So I'm not letting it out of my sight. I'm going to put a batch date on it, which is when it's born, and it has to be disposed of after 3 months unopened because it's just not safe.
I saw another question. This one might be good for you too, April. Can you register in one county and sell your cottage food in another county?
Yes, for cottage food in California now, as long as you have, well, direct sales is fine too, but you can sell any county in the state of California. You can even mail it now within the state of California, which is a huge bonus for all of us. It's very exciting. But as far as elderberries that are grown, I think this is the same question from somebody who was asking about being an approved source. So I would definitely encourage you to get a hold of your county agricultural commissioner's office, because if you are growing elderberries on your property, as long as you are in direct care, custody, and control of the property or have a lease agreement, you can become a certified agricultural producer, which is the way I have set my business up. And so you are an approved source for your own ingredients. And that gives you a lot more, you get a whole new set of regulations now, and they lay on top of each other, and it's this really cool thing that happens. So I encourage you to do that if you're growing elderberries.
That's great. And if you enjoy hearing about these regulations, then we encourage you to, to join us next week. I think we have to close there, but we are going to be doing a second session next Wednesday at 2 p.m. where we'll talk about drying and more about processing. And we'll talk about the processed foods registration and using that mechanism to make products. We'll also be hearing from Oshala Herbs and Oceanside Jams, two practitioners who work with elderberry. So thank you so much to our speakers for sharing their knowledge. Thank you to all of you who joined today. We will be sending out an evaluation for the workshop, and we'll be sharing some follow-up resources. So keep an eye for that in the next few days in your email. And in the meantime, there's lots of great food safety resources at the UC Food Safety website, and resources on growing elderberry at UC Syrup's website. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.